They fired me for disloyalty because I questioned a single line item in a quarterly budget report. That's what they said anyway. But the real reason? I had gotten too close to something they never wanted anyone to see. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I'm Sarah Martinez, and I spent 8 years in military intelligence before transitioning to corporate finance. When you've analyzed enemy financial networks in Afghanistan and tracked insurgent money flows through shell companies across 3 continents, reviewing quarterly reports for a mid-sized logistics company should have been routine. Should have been simple. It wasn't. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday at Meridian Logistics. I arrived at 6:30 a.m., an hour before most of the office stirred to life. Old habits from the military die hard, and I've always believed that the early hours belong to those who want to get ahead. I had my usual black coffee, pulled up the Q3 financial reports, and began my systematic review of every expense category, every vendor payment, every allocation. That's when I saw it. Line 47 under Operational Consultancy, $847,000 paid to something called Strategic Advisory Partners LLC. The amount wasn't necessarily alarming for a company our size, but the vendor name was unfamiliar. In my 3 years at Meridian, I'd memorized every major contractor, every consulting firm, every regular expense. This one was new. I cross-referenced it with our approved vendor database. Nothing. I checked previous quarters. This was the first payment to Strategic Advisory Partners, ever. My training kicked in. The same methodical approach I'd used when following money trails that led to terrorist financing networks. Something felt off. I pulled up the invoice details. The work description was vague. Strategic business consultation and market analysis services. No project specifics, no deliverables outlined, no contact information beyond a P.O. box in Delaware. Every legitimate consulting contract I'd ever processed had detailed scopes of work, clear deliverables, direct contact information. This looked like what we used to call a ghost payment in the intelligence community. By 9 a.m., I had compiled a list of questions. Nothing accusatory, just standard due diligence queries that any competent financial analyst would ask. I walked to the executive floor, knocked on CEO Richard Blackstone's corner office, and waited for permission to enter. Blackstone was reviewing something on his phone when I walked in. He looked up with the expression of someone interrupted during important business. "Sarah, what can I do for you?" I placed the printed report on his mahogany desk, pointing to line 47. "I'm reviewing the Q3 expenses and wanted to clarify this consulting payment. I can't find Strategic Advisory Partners in our vendor system, and the invoice lacks the detail we usually require for payments this size." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In Afghanistan, I'd learned to read micro-expressions, the tiny tells that revealed when someone was hiding something. Blackstone's left eye twitched, and he shifted slightly in his chair. "That's been approved through proper channels," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Sometimes we engage specialized consultants for sensitive strategic matters." "I understand," I replied calmly. "But our compliance protocols require vendor verification and detailed documentation for any payment over $500,000. I just need to complete the file with the proper paperwork." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Blackstone's fingers drummed once against his desk, a nervous habit I'd noticed during previous tense board meetings. "Sarah, I appreciate your attention to detail, but this particular engagement requires discretion. The work involves competitive intelligence, and excessive documentation could compromise confidential strategies." I nodded, maintaining my professional demeanor. "Of course, but our auditors will expect to see standard verification during the annual review. Perhaps I could speak with someone at Strategic Advisory to obtain a redacted scope document that protects sensitive details while satisfying compliance requirements." That's when his mask slipped entirely. Blackstone stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "Sarah, I think you're overstepping your authority here. This payment has been reviewed and approved by the appropriate executives. Your job is to process approved expenses, not to question strategic decisions made above your pay grade." The dismissal stung, but I'd faced worse from colonels who thought an enlisted intelligence analyst had no business questioning their tactical decisions. I'd been right then, too. "I'm just trying to ensure we meet our fiduciary responsibilities," I said evenly. "Your responsibilities," he said, pointing toward the door, "are to support the decisions of senior leadership, not to second-guess them. I don't want to hear about this vendor again, unless it's to confirm the payment has been processed correctly." I left his office with my questions unanswered and a growing certainty that something was deeply wrong. The military had taught me that the biggest threats often hid behind the most aggressive defensiveness. Leaders who had nothing to hide didn't get hostile when subordinates asked reasonable questions. Back at my desk, I couldn't concentrate on the rest of the quarterly review. Strategic Advisory Partners LLC kept pulling at my attention like a loose thread that might unravel something much larger. During lunch, I did what any former intelligence analyst would do. I started digging. Delaware corporate records showed Strategic Advisory Partners had been incorporated just 4 months ago. The registered agent was a generic corporate services company that specialized in privacy-focused business formations. No listed officers, no business address beyond the P.O. box, no website, no LinkedIn profiles for key personnel. For a consulting firm receiving nearly $1 million in payments, they had remarkably little public presence. That afternoon, I processed the payment as directed, but I also created a private file on my personal drive. Screenshots of the invoice, notes about the vendor verification gaps, timestamps of my conversation with Blackstone, old habits from intelligence work, document everything, trust nothing at face value, and always follow the money. I didn't know it yet, but that file would eventually become the foundation for exposing one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in our industry's history. And Richard Blackstone's angry reaction to my simple questions would prove to be just the first domino in a chain of events that would ultimately destroy him. For now, though, I just knew that something was wrong, and I was apparently the only person asking the right questions. In my experience, that's usually when things get dangerous. What Blackstone didn't understand about me was that I hadn't stumbled into financial analysis by accident. My transition from military intelligence to corporate finance had been deliberate, strategic, and incredibly successful. Over 3 years at Meridian Logistics, I had transformed their financial oversight from a bureaucratic afterthought into a precision instrument that had saved the company millions. When I first arrived at Meridian, their expense tracking was a disaster. Previous analysts had treated their role like glorified bookkeepers, rubber stamping approvals and filing reports without asking hard questions. Within my first month, I identified $2.3 million in duplicate vendor payments spanning the previous 2 years. Nobody had noticed because nobody was looking. My military background had taught me that financial intelligence was just another form of battlefield awareness. In Kandahar, I'd tracked Taliban funding through a maze of hawala networks, cryptocurrency exchanges, and front companies. Those same skills translated perfectly to corporate finance. Money always leaves a trail, and I'd learned to follow even the faintest tracks. By my second year, I had implemented a vendor verification system that caught fraudulent invoices before they reached the payment stage. I cross-referenced every new contractor against government watch lists, verified business registrations, and required detailed documentation for any payment over $50,000. The system had already flagged 3 shell companies attempting to bill us for non-existent services. My direct supervisor, Janet Chen, relied on my analytical reports for her monthly presentations to the board. Last quarter, she'd told me, "Sarah, your insights have become indispensable. The board specifically asks for your fraud prevention metrics every meeting." The metrics were impressive. Since implementing my oversight protocols, we'd reduced questionable payments by 78%, improved vendor compliance to 94%, and recovered over $800,000 in erroneously processed invoices. I'd also identified procurement inefficiencies that saved another $1.2 million annually through better contract negotiations and bulk purchasing strategies. But my value went beyond just catching financial irregularities. My intelligence background had taught me to think systematically about risk assessment. I'd created threat models for various scenarios. What if a key vendor suddenly disappeared? What if currency fluctuations impacted our overseas operations? What if regulatory changes affected our compliance costs? These weren't abstract exercises. They were practical contingency plans that had already proven their worth. 6 months ago, when our primary shipping contractor in Southeast Asia suddenly went bankrupt, I had alternative vendors already vetted and contracts pre-negotiated. While our competitors scrambled to find new logistics partners, we transitioned seamlessly with zero interruption to customer deliveries. That continuity had retained 3 major clients who might otherwise have jumped to competitors. My colleagues in other departments had started consulting me informally on financial decisions. Marcus Rodriguez from procurement would stop by my desk before signing major contracts. "Run your eyes over this," he'd say. "You catch things the lawyers miss." Lisa Thompson from international operations relied on my currency risk analyses for hedging decisions. Last month, my recommendation to lock in exchange rates for our European contracts had saved the company $340,000 when the euro suddenly strengthened against the dollar. Even the IT department had learned to value my perspective. When they proposed upgrading our enterprise software system, I'd analyzed the total cost of ownership and identified hidden fees that would have added $180,000 to the project. My alternative vendor recommendation delivered the same functionality for 30% less cost. These weren't lucky guesses. This was the systematic application of intelligence analysis techniques to corporate financial management. In the military, we called it all-source intelligence, combining multiple data streams to create comprehensive situational awareness. In corporate finance, it meant looking beyond individual transactions to understand patterns, relationships, and potential threats. My annual performance reviews reflected this value. Last year, Janet had written, "Sarah consistently exceeds expectations in financial analysis and risk management. Her unique background brings a level of analytical rigor that has transformed our department's effectiveness. I recommend her for consideration for senior analyst positions." The senior analyst promotion had been discussed for months. Janet had hinted that it was practically guaranteed, pending final budget approvals. The new role would have included oversight of all vendor relationships, expanded authority over payment approvals, and direct reporting responsibility to the CFO. It would have also meant access to more financial data, more system permissions, and greater visibility into company operations. Looking back, I realize that promotion would have been Richard Blackstone's worst nightmare. A senior analyst with my background and access would have been perfectly positioned to uncover whatever he was hiding behind Strategic Advisory Partners and potentially other suspicious arrangements. But at the time, I was just focused on doing my job well. The morning after my confrontation with Blackstone, I arrived early as usual and found a note from Janet requesting a meeting. She was already at her desk with coffee and a concerned expression. "Sarah, I need to ask you about something," she said, closing her office door behind me. "Richard mentioned you've been asking questions about approved vendor payments." He seemed agitated. I chose my words carefully. "I identified a payment that didn't meet our standard documentation requirements. I asked for clarification so I could complete the compliance file." Janet nodded slowly. "Which vendor?" "Strategic Advisory Partners. The invoice lacked the detail we typically require for payments that size." Something flickered across her face. "I see. And what did Richard say?" "He said it was approved through proper channels and involved sensitive strategic work." Janet was quiet for a long moment, staring at her coffee cup. Finally, she looked up. "Sarah, you know I value your analytical work immensely, but sometimes in corporate finance, we need to balance thoroughness with diplomatic sensitivity. Not every question needs to be asked." The conversation felt wrong. Janet had always encouraged my detailed approach to vendor verification. She'd praised my willingness to ask hard questions and dig deeper when something didn't add up. This sudden shift toward diplomatic sensitivity was completely out of character. "I understand," I said carefully, "but our audit protocols exist for good reasons." "Of course they do. Just be selective about when you apply them. Some battles aren't worth fighting." As I left her office, I realized that my questions about Strategic Advisory Partners had triggered something much larger than a simple compliance issue. Janet's uncomfortable retreat from her usual standards, Blackstone's defensive anger, The complete lack of documentation for a nearly $1 million payment. These weren't random coincidences. I was starting to understand that my analytical skills, the same ones that had made me so valuable to Meridian Logistics, had just made me a threat to someone with something very serious to hide. The thing about transitioning from military intelligence to civilian life is that you never really stop being an intelligence analyst. The skills become part of who you are, and the networks you built don't simply disappear when you change careers. What most people at Meridian didn't know was that I had maintained active relationships within the financial intelligence community, relationships that had proven valuable in ways my corporate colleagues never suspected. Every month, I attended what appeared to be a casual meetup of military veterans in the financial sector. We called ourselves the Finance Hawks, and to outsiders, we looked like former service members networking over coffee and sharing war stories. The reality was more sophisticated. We were a loose collective of analysts, investigators, and financial professionals who had learned to work together during our military careers and continued collaborating in civilian roles. The group included Amanda Foster, who now worked as a senior investigator for the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. There was David Kim, a forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Review Group. Maria Santos had transitioned to Bank Secrecy Act compliance at a major regional bank. Jake Morrison worked international money laundering cases for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We met at a small cafe near the Federal Building downtown, usually on the last Thursday of each month. Officially, we discussed professional development and veteran employment issues. Unofficially, we shared insights about emerging financial crime patterns, helped each other navigate complex cases, and occasionally provided informal consultations when someone encountered something suspicious in their respective organizations. The relationships were built on mutual trust earned through shared service and a common understanding that financial crimes often crossed jurisdictional boundaries. A shell company identified in a corporate fraud case might connect to an international money laundering network. A suspicious vendor payment at a private company might link to a broader pattern of criminal activity. By sharing information appropriately and within legal boundaries, we could sometimes identify threats that individual agencies or companies might miss. 3 days after my confrontation with Blackstone, I found myself thinking about strategic advisory partners during our monthly meetup. Amanda was discussing new patterns in corporate fraud cases when I decided to ask a hypothetical question. Have any of you seen cases involving Delaware shell companies being used for consulting contracts? I asked casually. Specifically, companies with minimal documentation receiving large payments for vaguely defined strategic services? David looked up from his coffee. That's textbook money laundering structure. Create a legitimate-looking consulting company. Bill real businesses for fake services. Wash the money through normal business accounts. We see variations of it constantly. Maria nodded. The banking side catches some of these through suspicious activity reports. But if the payments come from established companies with good banking relationships, they often slip through initial screening. What would trigger a deeper investigation? I asked. Amanda leaned forward slightly. Multiple factors. Rapid incorporation, followed by large payments. Minimal business activity beyond receiving transfers. Payments that don't match typical patterns for legitimate consulting work. But honestly, most of these only get flagged when they're part of larger investigations. Jake added, the Treasury guidance says companies should verify vendor legitimacy before making substantial payments. If a business is processing payments to shell companies without proper due diligence, they could face compliance penalties, even if they weren't knowingly involved in money laundering. The conversation continued around other topics, but I filed away their insights. Strategic Advisory Partners matched several red flags they'd described. Recent incorporation, minimal documentation, large payments for vague services, Delaware registration designed for privacy. If I'd encountered this pattern during my military service, I would have immediately escalated it for investigation. After the meeting, Amanda walked with me toward the parking garage. Your question about consulting shells seemed specific, she said quietly. Is this theoretical, or are you seeing something at work? I chose my words carefully. Probably nothing. I encountered a payment that didn't meet our usual documentation standards, but management says it's approved. Trust your instincts, she said. In my experience, when financial analysts with intelligence backgrounds get concerned about payment patterns, they're usually right. If you ever need informal guidance about reporting obligations or want someone to review documentation, you know how to reach me. That weekend, I decided to conduct my own informal investigation using publicly available resources. I started with basic corporate records searches, the same techniques I'd use to verify legitimate vendors. Strategic Advisory Partners Delaware filing showed incorporation on March 15th, just 4 months before their first payment from Meridian. The registered agent was Corporate Services of Delaware, a company that specialized in providing privacy-focused business registration services. I searched for any online presence. No website, no social media profiles, no business directory listings, no press releases or news mentions. For a consulting company receiving substantial payments, their digital footprint was essentially non-existent. Next, I examined the payment timing. Strategic Advisory Partners had received their first payment from Meridian on July 23rd, exactly 4 months and 8 days after incorporation. In my experience, legitimate consulting relationships typically involved some period of relationship building, proposal development, and contract negotiation. This timeline suggested either an unusually rapid engagement process or a relationship that existed before the company was formally incorporated. I also researched other companies that might have paid Strategic Advisory Partners. Using business intelligence databases available through my professional memberships, I searched for any other organizations that had reported payments to companies with similar names or the same Delaware registration address. The results were interesting. 3 other mid-sized logistics companies had made payments to similarly structured consulting firms incorporated within the past year, all using the same Delaware registration service. This pattern suggested either a legitimate consulting firm that worked exclusively with logistics companies while maintaining unusual privacy practices, or a coordinated scheme targeting multiple companies in the same industry. Given the lack of any verifiable business activities, the latter seemed more likely. By Sunday evening, I had compiled a file that would have impressed my former intelligence supervisors. Corporate records, payment timelines, industry pattern analysis, and network mapping of related entities. The evidence didn't prove criminal activity, but it painted a picture that any competent investigator would want to examine more closely. The question was what to do with this information. I couldn't make accusations based on preliminary research, but I also couldn't ignore indicators that suggested potential fraud. My military training had taught me that the worst intelligence failures often resulted from analysts who identified threats but failed to escalate them appropriately. As I prepared for another week at Meridian, I realized I was walking a careful line between my duty as a corporate employee and my broader responsibility as someone with the skills to identify potential financial crimes. Whatever Strategic Advisory Partners really was, I was probably the only person at Meridian with both the capability and inclination to find out. The following Monday, I arrived at work to find an email from Janet requesting all vendor documentation files be moved to a new centralized system. The message, sent at 11:47 p.m. the previous evening, explained that senior management wanted to, quote, streamline vendor oversight and ensure consistent documentation standards across all departments. Under normal circumstances, this would have seemed like a reasonable administrative change. But the timing felt suspicious. I'd questioned Strategic Advisory Partners on Tuesday, and by the following Monday, all vendor files were being moved to a system that would likely require special access permissions to review. I spent the morning transferring files as requested, but I made sure to create backup copies of everything related to Strategic Advisory Partners and several other vendors that had triggered my attention during routine reviews. These copies went on to an encrypted external drive that I kept in my personal possession, a habit from military service where important intelligence sometimes disappeared from official systems. While transferring files, I noticed something interesting in the metadata. The original Strategic Advisory Partners invoice had been created on July 18th, 5 days before the payment date. But when I examined the file properties more closely, I discovered it had been modified on July 22nd, just 1 day before payment processing. Someone had edited the invoice after its initial creation. Unfortunately, the modifications weren't visible in the final PDF, and I didn't have access to version history in our accounting system. But the metadata timeline suggested that someone had made last-minute changes to the invoice, possibly to address documentation issues or adjust payment details. During my lunch break, I called Amanda Foster from a secure location outside the office building. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation about consulting shells," I said. Would it be helpful if I could provide specific documentation for an informal review? Potentially, she replied carefully. If you're concerned about potential money laundering, there are proper channels for reporting suspicious activities. FinCEN has established procedures for financial institutions and businesses to report concerns about unusual transactions. What about situations where internal reporting doesn't seem appropriate? Amanda paused. If you believe your employer might be involved in questionable financial activities, either knowingly or unknowingly, you have several options. The Treasury Department operates a hotline for reporting suspected financial crimes. The FBI has corporate fraud units. And there are whistleblower protections for employees who report financial crimes in good faith. I'm not ready to make formal reports yet, I said. But if I wanted someone with expertise to review documentation and help me understand whether my concerns are justified, would that be possible? Off the record, between veterans, yes. Send me what you have through secure channels, and I'll give you my professional assessment. If it looks serious, we can discuss next steps. If it's nothing, you can focus on other priorities. That afternoon, I scanned copies of the Strategic Advisory Partners documentation and sent them through an encrypted email service to Amanda's personal account. Along with the vendor files, I included my research notes about incorporation timing, payment patterns, and the similar companies I'd identified in the logistics industry. Her response came back within 2 hours. Call me this evening from a secure location. At 7 p.m., I drove to a coffee shop 15 minutes from my apartment and called Amanda from my personal cell phone. Sarah, what you've sent me looks very concerning, she said without preamble. The pattern you've identified matches textbook money laundering structures we've seen in several recent cases. Shell companies incorporated just before receiving large payments, minimal documentation, similar schemes targeting multiple companies in the same industry sector. My stomach dropped. So this is likely criminal activity? I can't make that determination based on limited documentation, but it raises enough red flags that it should definitely be investigated by appropriate authorities. The question is whether your company is a victim of fraud or actively participating in money laundering. What would suggest active participation versus being a victim? Several factors. If payments are being made despite obvious red flags, if normal verification procedures are being bypassed, if employees who question the transactions face retaliation, if there are attempts to hide or modify documentation. Based on your description of management's reaction to your questions, this doesn't sound like a company that was innocently deceived. I told her about the aggressive shutdown when I asked for vendor verification, the sudden change in documentation procedures, and the modified invoice metadata. Amanda was quiet for a moment. Sarah, this sounds like a situation where someone in senior management is either directly involved in fraudulent activity or being pressured to facilitate it. Either way, you need to be very careful. People involved in financial crimes often react strongly when they feel threatened by exposure. What should I do? Document everything, every interaction, every file, every suspicious pattern. Keep copies in secure locations outside your workplace. And start thinking seriously about formal reporting. If this is what it appears to be, it's going to be exposed eventually. The question is whether you want to be seen as someone who helped uncover it, or someone who might have been complicit through inaction. Could there be legitimate explanations for what I'm seeing? Theoretically, yes. But in my experience, when financial analysts with your background identify patterns like this, they're usually correct. Trust your training and your instincts. After the call, I sat in the coffee shop parking lot thinking about the implications. If Amanda was right, Richard Blackstone wasn't just engaged in questionable business practices, he was potentially involved in serious financial crimes. And my questions about vendor documentation had inadvertently positioned me as a threat to his operation. The next morning, I noticed subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with me. Conversations stopped when I approached groups. People who usually shared casual workplace gossip became more formal and distant. Janet avoided eye contact during our weekly team meeting and announced that she would be handling all vendor-related communications directly going forward. This will ensure consistent messaging and reduce potential confusion about documentation requirements, she explained, though her tone suggested she was reading from a script rather than expressing her own views. After the meeting, I overheard Marcus from procurement telling Lisa from international operations, Janet says we should route vendor questions through her now instead of going directly to Sarah. Something about streamlining the approval process. I was being systematically isolated from the vendor oversight responsibilities that had been central to my role for 3 years. In intelligence work, we called this compartmentalization, limiting access to sensitive information to prevent unauthorized disclosure. But in this context, it felt more like preparation for my removal from any position where I might uncover additional suspicious activities. That evening, I updated my secured documentation files and began preparing for the possibility that my employment at Meridian Logistics might end much sooner than I had anticipated. The isolation campaign began immediately. By Wednesday, I discovered that my access to the vendor management database had been quietly revoked. When I tried to log in to review routine monthly reconciliations, the system displayed an error message. User permissions have been modified. Contact your administrator for assistance. I called IT support, and after 20 minutes on hold, a technician named Brian explained that my access had been temporarily suspended pending a system security audit. He couldn't provide details about when access would be restored or who had authorized the suspension. This was concerning for several reasons. First, vendor database access was essential to my core job responsibilities. Without it, I couldn't perform the financial analysis and oversight duties that comprised 70% of my role. Second, I'd been using the same access credentials for 3 years without any security issues. Third, no one had informed me about any pending audit. I walked to Janet's office to ask about the access suspension. Her assistant said she was in meetings all day and couldn't be disturbed. I sent an email requesting clarification about the database access and received an automated reply saying she was out of the office until Friday. By Thursday morning, I realized the access restriction was more extensive than just the vendor database. My permissions for the accounts payable system had been limited to read-only status. I could view transactions but couldn't modify anything or run the analytical reports I typically generated for monthly reviews. My access to the document management system where vendor contracts were stored had been completely removed. Someone was systematically stripping away my ability to investigate vendor relationships or access financial documentation. This wasn't a coincidence or a routine security measure. This was targeted and deliberate. During my lunch break, I decided to test the boundaries of what information I could still access. Using my remaining system permissions, I ran queries for other consulting payments made during the past year. What I found made my earlier concerns about strategic advisory partners seem minor by comparison. Over the previous 12 months, Meridian had paid substantial amounts to at least 6 different consulting companies with similar characteristics: recent Delaware incorporations, minimal documentation, vague service descriptions, and payment amounts just below the thresholds that would trigger additional oversight requirements. The total payments exceeded $4.2 million. The companies had names like Global Strategic Solutions LLC, International Business Consultants Inc., and Advanced Market Research Partners. Each had received between $600,000 and $850,000 across multiple payments, structured to avoid triggering the $500,000 single payment review threshold that I had established in our vendor protocols. Even more troubling, the payments showed clear patterns suggesting coordination. Strategic Advisory Partners received their first payment in July. Global Strategic Solutions had received payments in March and May. International Business Consultants had been paid in January and April. Advanced Market Research Partners showed payments in February and June. Someone was rotating payments among multiple shell companies, creating the appearance of diverse vendor relationships while actually funneling money to entities that appeared to be controlled by the same network. This was sophisticated financial engineering designed to evade internal oversight systems. I printed screen captures of the payment summaries before my access could be restricted further, and added them to my growing collection of documentation. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. Meridian wasn't just making questionable payments to one suspicious vendor. The company was involved in a systematic pattern of payments to multiple shell companies, totaling over $4 million in a single year. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from Marcus Rodriguez. He appeared at my cubicle looking uncomfortable and glancing around to see who might be watching. "Sarah, can we talk privately?" he asked quietly. We walked to a small conference room at the end of the hallway. Marcus closed the door and sat down heavily. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something," he said, lowering his voice. "I was called into Richard's office yesterday about vendor payments. He asked me specific questions about which vendors I discuss with you, whether you've asked me to provide documentation for any recent contractors, and if you've expressed concerns about any payment approvals." My pulse quickened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you occasionally review contracts when I ask for input, and that you've always been helpful and professional. But Sarah, he wasn't asking because he's happy with your work. He seemed angry that you've been involved in vendor discussions at all." Marcus leaned forward. "He also asked me to start routing all vendor communications through Janet instead of consulting with you directly. He said there have been, quote, concerns about consistent messaging, and that all vendor-related decisions should go through official channels." "Did he mention any specific vendors or payments?" Marcus shook his head. "No, but the whole conversation felt like I was being warned away from working with you. And honestly, it made me uncomfortable. You've helped procurement avoid several costly mistakes over the past year. Your input has been valuable, not problematic." After Marcus left, I sat in the empty conference room processing the implications. Blackstone wasn't just trying to prevent future questions about suspicious vendors. He was actively investigating my past interactions with colleagues to understand how much I might know and who else might be aware of problematic payments. This suggested that the vendor fraud extended beyond what I had already discovered. If Blackstone was worried about my conversations with procurement staff, there were probably additional suspicious transactions involving vendors that Marcus had reviewed or approved. That evening, I called Amanda again from the same secure location. "The situation has escalated," I told her. "I've identified additional shell companies receiving payments, totaling over $4 million in the past year. And management is now actively investigating my interactions with colleagues and restricting my system access." Amanda was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, what you're describing sounds like a major corporate fraud operation. Multiple shell companies, systematic evasion of oversight controls, and retaliation against employees who ask questions. This is serious criminal activity. I'm concerned about my safety at work. They're clearly trying to prevent me from accessing information or asking questions." "You need to make formal reports soon," Amanda said firmly. "If this is as extensive as it sounds, other agencies are probably already investigating related activities. Your documentation could be crucial evidence, but only if you report it through proper channels before you're completely cut off from information access." "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" "Days, not weeks. Once they've identified you as a threat, they'll either find a reason to terminate your employment, or they'll take more aggressive steps to prevent disclosure. In cases like this, companies often claim that employees who report financial crimes were actually involved in the criminal activity themselves." As I drove home, I realized that my informal investigation had crossed a line into something much more dangerous. I was no longer just a financial analyst who had noticed irregularities. I was a potential witness to systematic corporate fraud, and the people responsible knew I was asking questions they couldn't allow me to continue asking. The next few days would determine whether I could gather enough evidence to expose what was happening at Meridian, or whether Richard Blackstone would find a way to silence me first. Friday morning arrived with an email that made my blood run cold. The subject line read, "Mandatory Security Review Meeting," and it was scheduled for 2 p.m. that afternoon. The sender was Harold Vicks, Meridian's head of human resources, and the meeting attendees included Richard Blackstone, Janet Chen, and someone listed as external security consultant. I had never been called to a security review meeting in 3 years at Meridian. In fact, I wasn't aware that such meetings existed at our company. The timing, coming immediately after my system access restrictions and the investigation into my colleague interactions, felt ominous. During lunch, I made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Instead of eating in the company cafeteria, I drove to a nearby office supply store and purchased a small digital recording device. Military intelligence had taught me that when facing potential retaliation, documentation becomes your most powerful defense. I also used the time to send Amanda a comprehensive email through our secure communication channel. I attached all the evidence I had compiled about the shell company payments, documented the timeline of access restrictions and colleague warnings, and explained about the afternoon security review meeting. If something happens to my employment today, I wrote, you'll know it wasn't coincidental. This evidence needs to be preserved regardless of what they do to me. At 1:55 p.m., I walked into the conference room to find 4 people already seated. Blackstone at the head of the table, Janet to his right looking deeply uncomfortable, Harold Vicks with a thick folder of documents, and a woman I didn't recognize wearing a conservative gray suit and carrying a briefcase. Sarah, please have a seat, Blackstone said, gesturing to the chair directly across from him. This is Margaret Thompson from Meridian's external security consultancy. She specializes in workplace security assessments. Thompson opened her briefcase and pulled out a tablet and notepad. Ms. Martinez, we're conducting a routine review of employees with access to sensitive financial information. This is standard procedure for companies in the logistics sector, given the potential for industrial espionage and financial crimes. Nothing about this felt routine. I activated the recording device in my jacket pocket and folded my hands on the table. I understand your role involves reviewing vendor payments and financial documentation, Thompson continued. Can you describe your typical process for analyzing vendor relationships? The question seemed straightforward, but I sensed a trap. I verify that vendors meet our documentation requirements, ensure payments match approved contracts, and flag any irregularities for management review. And what constitutes an irregularity in your assessment? Payments to unverified vendors, invoices lacking proper detail, contracts that don't meet our standard terms, or payment patterns that seem unusual. Thompson made notes on her tablet. Have you identified any such irregularities recently? I looked at Blackstone, whose jaw was tense. I've flagged several vendors for additional documentation, as is standard procedure. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Specifically, have you questioned payments to legitimate consulting firms engaged by senior management? There it was. The real purpose of this meeting wasn't security assessment. It was interrogation about my questions regarding Strategic Advisory Partners and the other shell companies. I've asked for standard vendor verification documentation when payments didn't include the detail required by our policies, I replied carefully. Thompson leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, are you aware that excessive questioning of approved vendor relationships can constitute corporate espionage? Competitors often place employees in target companies to gather intelligence about business relationships and strategic partnerships. The implication was clear and outrageous. They were suggesting that my vendor oversight responsibilities constituted potential espionage activity. I'm not gathering intelligence for competitors, I said firmly. I'm performing the financial oversight duties outlined in my job description. Harold spoke for the first time. Sarah, we've received reports that you've been asking colleagues about vendor payments outside your direct responsibilities. Can you explain why procurement staff and international operations personnel have been contacted about vendor relationships? This was clearly based on Blackstone's investigation into my interactions with Marcus and others. I provide analytical support to other departments when requested. This collaboration has been approved and encouraged by my supervisor for 3 years. Janet shifted uncomfortably in her chair but said nothing. Thompson pulled up something on her tablet. We've also identified unusual computer activity associated with your user account, database queries outside normal business hours, access to vendor records unrelated to your current projects, and printing of documents containing sensitive financial information. Every query she described was part of my legitimate job responsibilities, but they were framing routine analytical work as suspicious activity. Those queries were conducted as part of my regular vendor oversight duties, I said. The documentation I printed included reports I generate monthly for management review. Blackstone finally spoke. Sarah, the concern isn't necessarily about individual activities. It's about the pattern. Excessive questioning of management decisions, unauthorized investigation of vendor relationships, unusual data access patterns, and discussions with colleagues about sensitive financial matters. He leaned back in his chair. Frankly, your behavior has raised questions about your loyalty to this company, and your commitment to following management directives. The word loyalty hit like a physical blow. In military service, questioning questionable orders wasn't disloyalty, it was professional responsibility. But Blackstone was reframing my oversight duties as betrayal. "I've been performing the same analytical functions for 3 years," I said. "My performance reviews have consistently rated my work as exceptional." Thompson consulted her notes. "That may be true, but recent behavior suggests a change in your priorities. Corporate loyalty requires trusting management decisions even when you don't have complete information about strategic rationales." Harold opened his folder. "Sarah, we need to address these concerns directly. Going forward, your role will be modified to focus exclusively on routine transaction processing. You'll no longer have authority to question vendor relationships or request additional documentation from management-approved contractors." This wasn't just a restriction. This was the elimination of every aspect of my job that had made me valuable to Meridian and given me the ability to identify financial irregularities. "You're removing my analytical responsibilities?" I asked. "We're clarifying your responsibilities," Blackstone said. "Process payments as directed, maintain transaction records, and escalate questions through proper channels rather than conducting unauthorized investigations." I realized they were creating a paper trail to justify my eventual termination. By framing my vendor oversight work as unauthorized investigation and disloyalty, they could claim I had exceeded my authority and posed a security risk. "I need time to consider these changes," I said. Thompson closed her tablet. "These aren't changes subject to negotiation, they're directives based on security concerns. Your compliance with these restrictions will be monitored closely." As I left the conference room, I understood that this meeting had been my unofficial termination notice. They couldn't fire me immediately without raising questions, but they had created justification for my removal and eliminated my access to information that could expose their criminal activities. I had perhaps days, maybe weeks, before they found a pretext to end my employment. The question was whether I could gather enough evidence to expose their fraud scheme before they silenced me permanently. That weekend, I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting passively for Meridian to find an excuse to fire me, I was going to force the truth into the open. My military training had taught me that when facing a superior enemy force, sometimes the best defense is a calculated offensive strike. I spent Saturday creating multiple backup copies of all my documentation and evidence. Everything went into encrypted cloud storage accounts, secure email services, and physical drives stored in different locations. If something happened to me or my employment, the evidence would survive. On Sunday, I called Amanda and arranged to meet her at a secure location. We met at a small restaurant 40 minutes outside the city, far from anywhere we might encounter Meridian employees or federal colleagues who might recognize us. "I'm ready to make formal reports," I told her without preamble, "but I need to understand the process and timing. They're clearly preparing to terminate my employment, and I want to ensure the evidence gets to appropriate authorities before they can destroy documentation or claim I was involved in criminal activity." Amanda had brought her own files. "I've been doing background research since our last conversation. Sarah, this situation is more serious than we initially discussed. The pattern you've identified at Meridian matches intelligence we've developed about a larger financial network operating across multiple companies." She opened a folder containing corporate charts and financial flow diagrams. "Strategic Advisory Partners and the other shell companies you've identified appear to be connected to a broader money laundering operation. We believe the consulting payments are being used to move money offshore to accounts controlled by corporate executives." My stomach dropped. Offshore accounts? The consulting companies appear to be fronts. They receive payments from legitimate businesses like Meridian, then transfer the money through multiple intermediary accounts before it reaches final destinations in banking secrecy jurisdictions. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore. She showed me a flowchart that made my blood run cold. Strategic Advisory Partners was just one node in a complex network of shell companies, all ultimately controlled by a small group of individuals who were systematically draining money from the companies they were supposed to be managing. How long has this been happening? Based on our preliminary investigation, at least 3 years, possibly longer. The total amount we've tracked so far exceeds $20 million across multiple companies in the logistics and shipping sectors. $20 million. I had stumbled onto a major corporate fraud scheme, and Richard Blackstone wasn't just stealing from Meridian. He was part of an organized criminal network. What's my role in exposing this? Amanda leaned forward. Your documentation and insider access make you a crucial witness. But you're also in significant danger. People involved in schemes this large don't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operation. She pulled out another document. We want to offer you formal protection as a cooperating witness. This would involve wearing recording devices during workplace interactions, documenting additional evidence under FBI supervision, and eventually testifying before a grand jury. The implications were staggering. I would be going undercover in my own workplace, gathering evidence against my CEO, while pretending to comply with their restrictions on my activities. What kind of timeline are we looking at? We need to move quickly. Once they decide you're too much of a threat, they'll either fire you or take more aggressive action to prevent disclosure. We're talking about days, not weeks. That evening, I agreed to become a formal cooperating witness. Amanda connected me with FBI agents specializing in corporate financial crimes, and by Monday morning, I was wearing a sophisticated recording device and carrying encrypted communication equipment. My instructions were clear. Continue performing my modified job duties while documenting any evidence of fraudulent activities. Record all interactions with Blackstone, Janet, or other managers. Gather any additional financial records I could access without raising suspicion. Monday at work felt surreal. I sat at my desk processing routine transactions while wearing federal recording equipment and knowing that my colleagues were unknowingly participants in a major criminal investigation. Every conversation might contain evidence that would eventually be presented to a grand jury. At 10:30 a.m., Janet approached my desk with a stack of invoices. Sarah, I need these processed by end of day. Standard payments, all pre-approved. I glanced through the invoices and my heart nearly stopped. 3 of them were payments to companies I hadn't seen before. International Strategic Consulting Group, Global Market Analysis LLC, and Advanced Business Solutions, Inc. Each invoice was for amounts between $600,000 and $750,000, with the same vague service descriptions and minimal documentation that characterized the other shell companies. These vendors aren't in our approved database, I said, activating my recording device. I'll need verification documentation before I can process payments this large. Janet's expression hardened. Sarah, we discussed this last week. Your new responsibilities focus on payment processing, not vendor verification. These have been approved through proper channels. But our compliance policies require vendor verification for any payment over $500,000. I can't process these without proper documentation. The documentation requirements have been modified for strategic consulting relationships. Process the payments as directed. I was recording Janet explicitly instructing me to violate our established compliance procedures. This was exactly the kind of evidence the FBI needed to demonstrate that Meridian management was knowingly facilitating fraudulent transactions. I understand, I said carefully. Can you provide me with the modified procedures in writing so I can ensure I'm following current policies? Janet hesitated. I'll send you updated guidelines later today. For now, just process these invoices. After she left, I photographed the invoices with the covert camera I'd been provided and sent them through encrypted channels to my FBI contacts. 3 more shell companies, nearly $2 million in additional fraudulent payments, and recorded evidence of management instructing me to bypass compliance procedures. At lunch, I received a secure message from Amanda, payment destinations confirmed. All 3 companies transfer funds to same offshore network. Total scheme value now estimated at $35 million across 7 companies. $35 million. Blackstone wasn't just embezzling from Meridian. He was operating a massive theft operation that was systematically draining multiple companies while using legitimate employees like me to process the fraudulent transactions. That afternoon, I processed the 3 payments as instructed, but each transaction was being monitored by federal agents who were building a comprehensive map of the money laundering network. Every fraudulent payment I processed was one more piece of evidence that would eventually destroy Blackstone's criminal operation. As I left work that evening, I realized I was no longer just a financial analyst who had noticed irregularities. I was an undercover federal witness gathering evidence that would bring down one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in recent history. The question was whether I could gather enough evidence before Blackstone realized what I had become. The trap was set on Wednesday morning when Blackstone called an emergency board meeting. I learned about it through a company-wide email sent at 7:15 a.m., announcing that all department heads and senior analysts needed to attend a strategic review session at 10 a.m. in the main conference room. I wasn't technically a senior analyst anymore after my role had been restricted, but Janet told me to attend anyway. "Richard specifically requested that you be present," she said, avoiding eye contact. "He wants all financial staff to hear the new strategic direction." As I prepared for the meeting, my FBI contacts sent me updated instructions through our secure communication system. High probability this meeting is designed to test your reaction to something specific. Maintain normal behavior patterns. Record everything. Do not reveal any knowledge beyond what you should reasonably possess as a restricted financial analyst. I arrived at the conference room to find an unusual arrangement. Instead of the typical oval table setup, chairs were arranged in rows facing a presentation screen. Blackstone stood at the front with a slide deck already loaded, and two men I didn't recognize sat in the back corner taking notes. The atmosphere felt more like an interrogation than a strategic planning session. "Good morning, everyone," Blackstone began as the room filled with about 20 staff members. "Today we're going to discuss Meridian's consulting relationships and the importance of maintaining confidentiality around our strategic partnerships." The first slide showed a generic corporate structure diagram with boxes labeled Internal Operations, Strategic Consultants, and Market Expansion. Nothing specific, but the focus on consulting relationships wasn't coincidental. Over the past quarter, we've significantly expanded our use of specialized consulting firms to help navigate complex international markets, he continued. These relationships require absolute discretion because they involve competitive intelligence and proprietary strategies that our competitors would love to access. I activated my recording device and took notes like everyone else, but my attention was focused on the two unidentified men in the back. They weren't taking notes about the presentation. They were watching the staff, particularly me. Blackstone advanced to the next slide, which showed a list of approved strategic consulting firms. I recognized several names: Strategic Advisory Partners, Global Strategic Solutions, International Business Consultants, and Advanced Market Research Partners. He was openly discussing the shell companies, presenting them as legitimate business relationships. "These firms provide services that are essential to our competitive positioning," he said. "However, their work requires them to maintain minimal public profiles to protect their methodologies and client relationships." A hand went up from the procurement team. "Should we expect additional documentation requirements for these consulting relationships?" Blackstone's smile was cold. "Actually, we're implementing streamlined procedures for strategic consulting contracts. Traditional vendor verification processes can compromise the confidentiality these firms require. Finance will process these payments through expedited channels." He was announcing a formal policy to bypass the oversight procedures that had allowed me to identify the fraudulent payments. This wasn't just about covering up past crimes. He was institutionalizing the fraud to make future theft easier. "Questions about strategic consulting relationships should be directed exclusively to senior management," he continued, his eyes finding me in the third row. "Staff members who attempt to investigate these relationships or share information about them outside proper channels will be considered security risks." The threat was unmistakable. Anyone who asked questions about the shell companies would face termination for security violations. During the coffee break that followed, I overheard a conversation between the two unidentified men and Harold from Human Resources. They were standing near the back exit, speaking in low voices. "The Martinez situation needs resolution," one of them said. "She's been flagged as a potential problem for weeks. We have documentation establishing patterns of unauthorized investigation and questionable loyalty," Harold replied. "Termination can be justified on security grounds. Timing is critical. The consulting relationships are entering a sensitive phase and we can't afford internal disruptions." I moved closer while pretending to check my phone, using the recording device to capture their conversation. "What about the other financial staff?" the second man asked. "Chen is cooperative. She understands the importance of following directives without excessive questions. The junior analysts don't have access to sensitive information. They were discussing my termination as a fait accompli. The only question was timing and justification. When the meeting resumed, Blackstone announced a new, quote, confidentiality protocol that would require all financial staff to sign additional non-disclosure agreements, specifically covering strategic consulting relationships. Violation of these agreements would result in immediate termination and potential legal action. Sarah Martinez, please remain after the meeting, he said as others began to file out. We need to discuss your implementation of these new procedures. As the room emptied, I found myself alone with Blackstone, the two unidentified men, and Harold. The atmosphere shifted immediately from corporate presentation to confrontation. Sarah, we have a problem, Blackstone said, closing the conference room door. Our security assessment has identified significant concerns about your recent activities. One of the unidentified men opened a laptop and turned it toward me. The screen showed a detailed log of my computer activities: database queries, document downloads, printing records, and email communications. This analysis shows unusual patterns in your system usage, he said. Excessive access to vendor databases, printing of confidential financial documents, and data queries outside your authorized responsibilities. They had been monitoring my computer activities for weeks, probably since I first questioned Strategic Advisory Partners. These activities suggest possible corporate espionage or preparation for unauthorized disclosure of confidential information, Blackstone continued. Combined with your questioning of management-approved vendor relationships, this creates serious security concerns. Harold placed a document on the table in front of me. We're offering you the opportunity to resign voluntarily, rather than face termination for security violations. This resignation agreement includes enhanced confidentiality provisions and a settlement that protects both parties. I looked at the document without touching it. What kind of confidentiality provisions? Absolute prohibition on discussing Meridian's business relationships, financial arrangements, or internal procedures with anyone outside the company, Harold explained. Violation would result in significant financial penalties and potential criminal prosecution. They wanted me to sign away my right to report what I had discovered about their fraud scheme. The settlement offer was actually hush money, designed to prevent me from cooperating with law enforcement. I need time to review this, I said carefully. Blackstone leaned forward. Sarah, this offer expires at the end of business today. After that, we'll proceed with formal termination and security-related investigations that could impact your future employment prospects. As I left the conference room, I realized they had made a critical mistake. By presenting me with hush money and explicit threats about discussing their business relationships, they had provided the FBI with clear evidence of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. What they didn't know was that every word of their threats had been recorded, and their attempt to silence me had just given federal prosecutors additional criminal charges to pursue against everyone involved in the conspiracy. I left the conference room carrying the resignation agreement, but instead of returning to my desk, I walked directly to the parking garage and called the emergency number my FBI contacts had provided. Within minutes, I was speaking to Agent Jennifer Walsh, the lead investigator on the case. Rage. They just offered me hush money, I said without preamble. $20,000 to resign and sign a confidentiality agreement that would prevent me from discussing their business relationships with anyone. Did you record the conversation? Every word. They explicitly threatened criminal prosecution if I disclosed information about their consulting arrangements. And they've been monitoring my computer activities for weeks. Agent Walsh was quiet for a moment. Sarah, this changes our timeline significantly. If they're offering settlement money and making explicit threats, they're preparing to eliminate you as a witness. We need to accelerate our operation. What does that mean? It means we're moving today. Within the next few hours, we'll be executing search warrants on Meridian's offices and several related locations. Your role is to return to work, act normally, and document any additional evidence you can gather before we arrive. My hands were shaking as I ended the call. After weeks of careful evidence gathering, the federal investigation was about to become very public, very quickly. I returned to my desk and spent the next hour processing routine transactions while my mind raced. Around me, colleagues worked on normal Wednesday tasks, completely unaware that federal agents were preparing to seize the building and arrest senior management. At 2:15 p.m., I received a secure message from Agent Walsh. Federal Task Force en route. Estimated arrival 3:30 p.m. Maintain normal activities. Do not alert anyone to pending action. I had just over an hour before Meridian Logistics would be transformed from a functioning business into a federal crime scene. At 2:45 p.m., Blackstone appeared at my desk with an expectant expression. "Sarah, have you had time to review the resignation agreement?" I looked up from my computer screen. "I'm still considering the terms." His jaw tightened. "As I mentioned, this offer expires at 5 p.m. today. After that, we'll proceed with termination for security violations." "I understand the timeline," I said calmly. "I'm just being thorough in my review." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Sarah, I want to be clear about something. The security concerns we've identified are serious. Companies in our industry take corporate espionage very seriously, and employees who mishandle confidential information can face criminal charges beyond just employment termination." I activated my recording device. "Are you saying that asking for vendor documentation constitutes corporate espionage?" "I'm saying that unauthorized investigation of approved business relationships, combined with unusual computer activity and discussions with outside parties, creates a pattern that raises legitimate security concerns." "What outside parties?" Blackstone's eyes narrowed. "We have reasons to believe you may have discussed confidential company information with individuals outside Meridian. That would constitute a serious breach of your employment agreement." He was fishing, trying to determine if I had reported their activities to authorities. His concerns suggested they were aware that federal investigators might be involved. "I haven't shared any confidential company information inappropriately," I said, which was technically true. Since my cooperation with the FB, I was entirely appropriate under federal whistleblower statutes. "Good," he said, but his expression remained suspicious. "In that case, I'm sure you'll see the value in resolving this situation amicably through the resignation agreement." After he left, I realized he was under pressure from someone higher in the criminal network. His increasingly aggressive attempts to secure my silence suggested that other conspirators were demanding immediate resolution of the Sarah Martinez problem. At 3:25 p.m., I received a text message from an unknown number. "Federal agents approaching building. Maintain position. Document any destruction of evidence." Through my office window, I could see several black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. Men and women in dark suits were exiting the vehicles and moving toward the building entrances. Some carried briefcases, others had equipment cases that probably contained computer forensics tools. At 3:28 p.m., the fire alarm went off. This wasn't a scheduled drill. Someone in management had activated the alarm system, probably hoping to clear the building before federal agents could secure evidence. Throughout the office, employees began moving toward the exits, but instead of orderly evacuation, there was obvious confusion about whether this was a real emergency. I remained at my desk, following my instructions to document any evidence destruction. Through the glass walls of the executive offices, I could see frantic activity. Janet was rapidly deleting files from her computer. Harold was feeding documents into a shredder. Blackstone was on his phone, speaking urgently to someone while gesturing toward the exits. At 3:31 p.m., the first federal agents entered our floor through the stairwell, bypassing the elevator systems that had been shut down by the fire alarm. They moved with practiced efficiency, immediately positioning themselves to prevent anyone from leaving, while their colleagues secured computers and file systems. FBI. This building is under federal investigation. All personnel remain in place and await instructions. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Employees froze at their workstations. The casual atmosphere of a normal Wednesday afternoon evaporated, replaced by the tense silence of a federal crime scene. Agent Walsh appeared at my desk within minutes. "Ms. Martinez, we're going to need you to remain available for debriefing, but first, can you identify the locations of financial records and computer systems that might contain evidence related to the vendor payments?" I pointed toward the server room, the accounting department, and the executive offices where I had seen document destruction attempts. Most of the financial data is stored digitally, but some of the executives were destroying physical documents when the alarm went off. 2 agents immediately moved toward the executive floor, while others began securing computer systems throughout the building. Across the office, I could see Blackstone standing near the conference room, his face pale and his hands shaking as Agent Walsh approached him with what appeared to be an arrest warrant. "Richard Blackstone, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, and theft from interstate commerce. You have the right to remain silent." The words carried clearly across the silent office as handcuffs were placed on the wrists of the man who had threatened my career for asking questions about vendor documentation. As they led him toward the elevators, Blackstone's eyes found mine across the room. The expression on his face was no longer one of corporate authority or confident threats. It was the look of someone who had just realized that his carefully constructed criminal enterprise had been destroyed by the financial analyst he had tried to silence. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse watching Richard Blackstone receive a 15-year prison sentence for his role in what prosecutors called one of the most sophisticated corporate theft schemes in recent history. The final tally was staggering: $47 million stolen from 7 companies across 4 states. Blackstone had used his position as CEO to systematically drain Meridian's resources while building an offshore empire that funded luxury homes, exotic cars, and secret investment accounts. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. Janet Chen, who had cooperated with investigators after her arrest, received 2 years probation. The shell companies were dismantled, and asset recovery efforts returned $31 million to the victimized companies. Meridian's board offered me Blackstone's former position as CEO, recognizing that my intelligence background and ethical standards were exactly what the company needed to rebuild. My first act was implementing the most comprehensive financial oversight system in the industry, designed to prevent any future fraud schemes from taking root. Today, I lead a team of analysts who understand that questioning authority isn't disloyalty, it's professional responsibility. We've created a culture where asking hard questions is rewarded, not punished, and where financial integrity isn't negotiable. The military taught me that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones hiding in plain sight. Richard Blackstone thought he could intimidate me into silence because he underestimated what a veteran with analytical training could accomplish when someone threatens everything she believes in. He was wrong. Jisimbori, if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share your own experiences with workplace corruption in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find the courage to speak up. Remember, sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to stay silent. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.